Good evening, dear doctors. Today we are going to conduct another great clinical episode on our XP Connect webinar education series, powered by Wallison Technology from G Health, who established fetal medicine as a specialty in India with his extensive knowledge and skills. Please welcome Dr. S. Suresh, Director, Mediscan Systems. Dr. Suresh holds several professional seats, including and not limited to the founder and chairman of Birth Defect Registry of India, member of Subcommittee Health Tamil Nadu State Planning Commission, member of WHO's Southeast Asia Expert Group on Birth Defects, member of ISWA Committee on Standards in First Trimester Ultrasound. Dr. Suresh is a dedicated teacher, has trained many doctors from India and abroad in this field. To his credit, he has several national and international publications. He is a recipient of multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards from FICCI, IMA, and many others. Before we get started, due to nationwide lockdown, there has been huge traffic load on internet services. If you experience temporary interruption in the transmission, kindly bear with us. We will sort it out immediately and resume. Kindly do not log out and keep refreshing the screen every 30 seconds. Now I welcome Sir to address our viewers with his clinical talk on managing monochorionic twins, opportunities and challenges. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to meet you all today, and I do hope you and your family are quite safe. Today is a special day because today is the Tamil New Year's Day and the beginning of New Year for us in Tamil Nadu. You must have heard over the past few days several webinars on twin pregnancies. So I thought I will focus on some of the key aspects of monochorionic twins with very practical application and where are the areas we need to focus on and also take care while reporting and how to manage complicated monochorionic twins. Now, first of all, let's look at the types of twins. All of you know that there are identical and fraternal twins. Fraternal twins where there is a dizygotic twin with two zygotes, but totally there are about 7 types of twins. We have what is known as half identical twins, where there is a 50-50 gene sharing from the mother and father. They call also mirror image twins, where mirror images of features, this is undetectable by testing, can only seen after birth. Now, we also have mixed chromosome twins, like 2 sperms, 2 eggs, fusion and then splitting. Superfetation, where another pregnancy occurring during a pregnancy, and superfecundation, where 2 different fathers are involved. So there are several types of twins, but we are going to be concerned with only these 2, and today we are going to talk about identical twins. Our aims and objectives are to understand what are monochorionic twins, why are they different, how to follow up, first trimester screening in monochorionic twins, how to investigate, triaging for complications, is it possible, how to identify complications, what are the treatment opportunities and success rates, when to deliver these babies, and the outcomes accordingly. So I thought we are going to understand, but I have to say we have to attempt to understand because twin research is going on in the world even as I'm talking to you. Now let's talk about what are monochorionic twins. These are twins which are derived from a single zygote where there is a single placenta with interconnecting vasculature, and that's very important. There's also a 2-layered membrane, which you can see with a high resolution transducer. They are genetically identical, but heterokaryotype can occur between the 2 twins. They can be discordant for structural anomalies. And why they are discordant, we will see as we go along. So the first thing is to confirm monochorionicity at 11 to 14 weeks. And we know between 11 and 14 weeks, the confirmation of monochorionicity by looking at the T sign is almost 99 to 100%. And we should not lose that opportunity. Dichorionic twins is seen in about 80% of the twins with the lambda sign, as you all know, but certainly the presence of the T sign must be documented, and all reports of twins must contain chorionicity. So, but when in doubt, always, supposing the patient is currently coming to you at 23 weeks, previously chorionicity not assigned, you treat them as monochorionic until and unless you have very clear evidence of dichronicity, like a double placenta or a good lambda sign. But why are monochorionic twins different? They are because they are genetically identical, and hence inherited disorders can affect both of them. The placental vascular angioarchitecture, which facilitates inter-twin blood exchange, which you don't see in dichorionic twins. The etiology of growth discordance is different from singletons and also from dichorionic twins. There's a higher risk of complications. Some complications are very unique to monochorionic twins. They need closer surveillance, and they are delivered earlier than dichorionic twins or singletons. Now, in each monochorionic placenta, the blood vessels which are communicating vary in type, number, direction, and also size. We look at placental cotyledons, cord insertions, the vascular patterns, and the vascular anastomosis. Here you can see there is a single cotyledon which is being shared by this twin and this twin. The sharing of the cotyledons is the key to understanding, where you can have an artery from this twin anastomosing with the vein of the other twin, or an artery from this twin anastomosing with the vein of this twin. So this baby has its own cotyledons, this baby has its own cotyledons, but there are also cotyledons that are shared between the two. In addition, there are superficial vessels which are arterioarterial and veno-venous. When you see the blood flowing in directions, the AV shunt goes in this direction and back in the opposite direction too. And it is important to remember that the placental angioarchitecture is very unique in each monochorionic twin. The number of anastomoses, the diameter of the vessels, and the number of the superficial anastomosis and deep anastomosis, they're all varied. Here you can see the number of anastomosis is sparse. Here you can see a large number of anastomosis which are there. And then we can see the arterioarterial anastomosis which is coming here. So this is called as a magistral vascular pattern, where you can see from a single tree there are branching vessels which are there. You should also remember that the artery and the vein are also coming back and going back to the same fetus. So here you can see the artery and the vein coming back to, so there are some returning vessels. There are some returning vessels on the other side, and there are some communicating vessels which are here. Here you can see a large arterioarterial anastomosis on the placenta. If you look at the monochorionic diamniotic twins, about 80% of them will have arterioarterial anastomosis, veno-venous in about 23%, AV 93%, and VA 82%. This is important to know because in momo twins, you have 100% arterioarterial anastomosis. And generally, we don't see twin-twin transfusion in momo twins. When there is a lack of arterioarterial anastomosis, then that paves the way for twin-twin transfusion to develop. Now, there are also three equators in the placenta. The first equator is called the membranous equator, where there's a dividing membrane, and this really is just a mechanical point. It does not have any functionality. The membranous equator does not play a role in any of the complications that we're going to see. Whereas the vascular equator is what is seen here. The vascular equator divides the placenta into the one which is supplying baby A and the other which is supplying the baby B. We'll come back and see more about it. Now there is a third anastomosis which we call as the third equator, which we call as the hemodynamic equator. The hemodynamic equator is on the surface of the placenta, and you can see here a very large arterioatrial anastomosis. And if you see the blood flow, it is flowing in this direction and it is flowing in the opposite direction. The presence of the arterioatrial anastomosis is very critical because this is called as the balancing anastomosis. When the pressure on one side of the baby is high, then blood is pushed to the other side, and when the pressure is high on the other side, it pushes to this side. So there's a hemodynamic balance is maintained here, and the lack of this anastomosis actually causes more blood to flow through one side, causing an imbalance and causing complications. It's also important to understand that the placenta itself is supplying nutrition and oxygen to the baby, and it is important that each of the babies share the placenta equally. The amount of placenta that is shared by one baby is called as placental territory sharing. When there is a discordant growth between the twins, once the placenta, there is an unequal share of the placenta on one side. Now, very asymmetric sharing can be associated with velamentous cord insertions. Now, it is not known whether it is because of the sharing the cord became velamentous, or because it was velamentous the sharing was smaller on the other side. That nobody has understood so far. Now, the vascular anastomotic pattern about the shared cotyledons which we saw, there is an increased net transfer to the other twin, and the AA and VV help to balance the blood flow. So velamentous cord insertions are very common in monochorionic twins. That is the area of the placental sharing, because it is sharing less and this area is sharing more. Now, the presence of anastomosis has a protective effect on the smaller fetus. The vascular anastomosis which is there, even though there is only a small area which is being shared, there is a nutritional supply deficit, the tendency for more blood to flow to the smaller twin. But in practice, large discordances with few anastomosis is possible, and when there's a huge discordance in the flow, problems arise. Monochorionic twins with similar weight discordance may have varying outcomes. So the outcome of the baby is largely dependent on the vascular hemodynamics which is there. It also depends on how much nutrition the baby is getting. But as long as the vascular supply is maintained, you can, even though baby is small in size, you can expect a good outcome. Now, this is the rationale for classification of selective fetal growth restriction. Now, if we look at outcomes of monochorionic versus dichorionic twins, we can obviously see miscarriage before 12 to 13 weeks, delivery, preterm delivery, growth restriction, fetal defects, all of them are much higher in monochorionic twins as compared to dichorionic twins. And also the perinatal mortality is much higher in monochorionic twins as compared to dichorionic twins. And that's why they are special. So how do we follow them up? We start following them up at 16 weeks. Once you identify chorionicity at 12 weeks, and if it's monochorionic, we ask the patient to come at 16 weeks, where we look at liquor, growth, placenta and cord insertions, and we also do the umbilical artery and the ductus venosus Dopplers. At 18 weeks, we do liquor, growth, Doppler of the umbilical and artery and ductus venosus, and also start doing the middle cerebral artery. Irrespective of whether the twins are growing equally or no, liquor is equal or no, we do the Dopplers routinely for all patients. Now, we also do a target scan and fetal echo, and when we do the fetal echo, we always do the myocardial performance index. I'll explain about that as we go by. Now, from then on, the patients are expected to come on a 2-weekly evaluation for liquor, growth, and Dopplers, and look for evolving findings. Now, let's go to first trimester and how do we deal with monochorionic twins in the first trimester. First of all, we must know what is known as the appearing twin. Appearing twin are more common in monochorionic twins. Scan prior to 6 weeks shows more than 80% of monochorionic twins are classified as singleton. Very common in practice, where initially, especially after IVF, they said there is an intrauterine pregnancy, and then after some time they say you got a twin pregnancy. 11% of DC twins are classified as singleton prior to 6 weeks. At scan at 11 weeks, undercounting has been done in almost 37%. So that's important to know. The second thing we need to know is the vanishing twin. The incidence of vanishing twin after the appearance of gestational sac in ART pregnancy is as high as 27% and spontaneously up to 40%. After the embryo has appeared in ART pregnancies, 38% can vanish and 7.3% spontaneously can vanish. Alteration of biochemical markers of vanishing twin can impact screening, and that's why it's important to know whether there's a vanishing twin or no. Now, the next issue is labeling twins. The labeling twins, if you look at twins, 85% of them will be oriented side to side, right? So the twin A to the left side and twin B to the right side, you can see the dividing membrane which is attached here beyond the cervix. The 15% of them are oriented cephalocaudal. Twin A is close to the cervix and twin B is near the fundus. And this can be identified on the video by looking at close to the cervix, twin A and twin B, and this is twin A and twin B from side to side. Now, why is it important? Accurate retention of labeling during serial scans is important, and that's why you say when twins are being followed, it is preferable the same operator follows the babies. Labeling of CVS and amnio samples have to be correct, and once the result comes, you should be able to relate that sample to that baby, the result of that sample to that baby, and follow up after invasive testing like CVS amnio to identify the correct fetus in case you have to go and do a selective reduction. You should also know about the perinatal switch phenomenon, where you are saying fetus A is the one near the cervix, but at time of delivery, fetus B may be delivered first. So parents may get confused. You said the smaller baby is going to come out first when the bigger baby came out first. And also there are lab issues in labeling. When you say fetus A and B, make sure the lab also does the same thing and you're able to relate to that. The next is dating of the pregnancy. We know that in IVF pregnancy, we use the embryo transfer date. And in natural conception in CR, you can have discordant CRLs in a MCDA twin. But whether to use the CRL of the larger twin or the smaller twin has been debated. Generally, they say larger twin, but more recently, they've advocated in IVF pregnancies, it may be better to use the smaller twin CRL. But since you have the date in IVF pregnancy, we should not have the problem. Now, the next is about screening. When you talk of screening, the first thing we need to know is the a priori probability or a priori risk. We would like to know that maternal age-related risk is generally considered as the a priori risk. But if a mother is carrying twin pregnancy, does the a priori probability change? The current opinion, according to the European registries, for monozygotic twins, it is just 0.34 times the singleton. That is maternal age-related probability for a singleton into 0.34. For dizygotic twins is 1.34 times the singleton. Maternal age-related probability for singleton into 1.34. That actually means that monozygotic twins have a lesser chance of having a Down syndrome as opposed to a dizygotic twin. Now, what are the challenges we face? Monochorionic twins have a higher percentage of increased NT due to vascular anastomosis and fluid imbalance. MC twins are not at higher risk for P21. Please remember that. And check for cardiac and other defects. So when there is increased NT in a monochorionic twin, we don't jump to the conclusion that this could be due to Down syndrome, but we have to look at other causes of increased NT. So here's a baby with a NT 4.5 and 2. So when you're calculating risks, we use the average NT for calculation. And remember, monochorionic twins have the highest discordance in the NTs as compared to dichorionic monozygotic twins. Now, discordant NT is due to the imbalance of placental fluids and not necessarily due to chromosomal abnormalities. Now, can we do biochemical screening? Biochemical screening in twins is calculated as a pseudo risk, and hence combined screening is less sensitive. Age plus NT basis can be given, which gives you a 75% detection rate for a 5% false positive rate. And when you do age plus NT, the combined test in dichorionic twins, 86%, this is a systematic review which was published in 2014, 86% for dichorionic twins, 87% for monochorionic twins. And we can also look at other markers. I'll tell you presently how they fare. We can also look at NIPT. But the most important thing is, in a monochorionic pregnancy, the result should come as a single probability for the whole pregnancy. There are labs who, when you send a monochorionic twin sample, they give different biochemical values and they calculate different risks for the same pregnancy, which is completely wrong. So just check whether monochorionic twins, there is a single risk which is given. Dichorionic twins is fetus specific, of course, you get two risks which are given. The issue of nasal bone has been shown that no differences between mono and dichorionic twins, but the sensitivity is less than in singletons. DV and TR, monochorionic twins, DV and TR are less accurate because they already have vascular anastomosis which are functioning in the first trimester. And because of that, you can have changes in the DV and TR depending on the pressure changes, not necessarily because of aneuploidy. So then comes the issue of cell-free DNA. Monozygotic pregnancies, that all monochorionic twins, cell-free DNA can be offered and sensitivity is the same as singletons. In dizygotic pregnancies, most dichorionic twins, remember some of dichorionic twins will also be monozygotic because of very early splitting. They will look like dichorionic twins. Here, the individual fetal fraction may differ, and if it is low in the affected fetus, false negative results can be reported. Overall sensitivity is 94.4, which is still sort of very close to the combined test which you are doing. Now, when you want to investigate monochorionic twins, I've taken some from the Society of Obstetric and Gynecology Canada guidelines. When a person is screened positive for T21, CVS in MC twins may miss heterokaryotype. Hence, they say amnio is preferred. In DC twins, experts can do a double CVS, and when you do amnio, you sample both sac if chorionicity is not established before 14 weeks, discordancy in the growth, and discordant for anomaly. So in other words, in a monochorionic twin, if you have both are progressing equally, no discordance in size, no discordance in Likert, and no discordance for anomalies, you can sample a single sac. And this is what the ISWOG guidelines also say. The fetal loss rate of 0.3 to 2.2% has been reported, and it is better to consider amniocentesis a little later rather than too early, as recommended by the guidelines. Now, when there is a discordancy in the crown rumpling, can we do some kind of a triaging and say, I can find out whether these twins will be in trouble later on. So several attempts have been made to do this. One of the things they have measured is the crown rump length. And a paper published in 2012 said if there's a discordant CRL, and if the discordancy is CRL is more than 10% or more, it is a pointer for selective IUGR, which may come later on. And they said discordant CRL is not predictive of twin-twin transfusion. Then they went on to study, Matthias group published in 2010. If there's a discordant NT, it is less than 50% sensitive for predicting TTTS. If there's a discordant DV with a reversal of A wave, then the relative risk is about 12 for developing TTTS. And if you have a discordant NT plus DV, the relative risk is 21 for developing TTTS. I told you earlier, when there is a discordancy, when there's an increased NT or a DV abnormality in a monoclonic twin, it may point to hemodynamic disturbance rather than aneuploidy. And this paper is actually explaining that. But more recently, a meta-analysis was brought out about early prognostic factors in the outcome, and they looked at NT and CRL discordance, and they said NT greater than 95th centile and CRL greater than 10% and twin-twin transfusion syndrome. They finally concluded, we have found it is not currently possible to predict adverse outcomes in MC twin pregnancies. So really we don't need to waste our time trying to predict, because at present we don't have a good proof that any changes in the early pregnancy is going to cause problems later on. Now let's look at complications of monoclonic twins. Growth is a problem. 14% may have, one of the babies may have a smaller growth. 10% have anomalies. 9% have twin-twin transfusion. 2% have trap sequence. 1 have twin anemia, polycythemia sequence, and other complications about 8%. These are cord insertions, abnormal cord insertions, abnormal Leica, and abnormal Doppler findings. Now, it's good to know that placental and vascular causes of complications almost amount to 26%. And that's why understanding the placenta in monoclonic twins is very, very important. Now, let's look at twins and structural defects. Now, the defect per monozygotic twin is almost 2 to 3 times that of a dizygotic twin. Now, when there is a structural defect, can they be concordant or discordant? A large number of defects, structural defects in monoclonic twins can be discordant even though they are identical twins. And this is because of what we call as a Diwali cracker hypothesis. When you burst a cracker, even though the cracker is round and it bursts, it doesn't split exactly into two. It splits into different forms. Similarly, when there is a splitting of the embryo, the zygote, and this splitting can cause more problems in one and less problems in the other. Also, it could be due to gene imprinting expression or due to hemodynamic factors. Our idea is to look at survival of the normal twin and also prevent preterm delivery. So when there's a discordance for anomaly in a monoclonic twin, we could classify it as lethal or non-lethal, but also has morbidity. Lethal anomalies like anencephaly, bilateral renal agenesis, or neural tube defects, ventriculomegaly, could be non-lethal morbid anomalies. There are 2 approaches to management. One is selective fetal reduction by bipolar RFA, or expectant management, because you can say anyhow it's a lethal abnormality, let the baby be delivered and it's going to die postnatally. Or you can do intervention which is needed. So we'll see that in a minute. Whereas for non-lethal abnormalities, again, expectant management versus selective fetal reduction. What we need to understand is the consequences of single intrauterine fetal demise. So when I see an anomaly, I'm going to ask myself, if left alone, will this baby have an intrauterine fetal demise? Because in a monoclonic twin, if one baby has a demise, then there's a high chance that the other baby is going to be, normal baby is going to be affected. Or whether this anomaly will cause polyhydramnios and cause preterm labor, for example, anencephaly. Now, if you look at the literature about managing anencephaly in a monoclonic twin, one group says you go and intervene, you do selective feticide. The other group says expectant management will give you very good outcomes. So there are conflicting opinions in the literature there. Now, so here are some anomalies, and you can now identify anomalies very early in gestation in the first trimester. So we look at lethal versus morbidity. So the management are lethal anomalies, interference only when the normal fetus is at risk. Non-lethal anomalies, balance between having a handicapped child and feticide-related complications has to be discussed, and counseling plays a very, very important role. The parents have to make the choice. Now, one of the methods of doing selective feticide in a monoclonic twin is called bipolar cord occlusion. Bipolar cord occlusion is done under ultrasound guidance, under local anesthesia. It's completely done under ultrasound guidance, where you can see the bipolar forceps coming and trying to catch the cord, and then you apply, you coagulate as per standard protocol till you can see cessation of flow in the cord, because you can see the heart still beating there. When there's bradycardia less than 70 beats per minute and the cord does not show color, we can stop the procedure, and you can use a fetoscope to identify the white areas where coagulation has happened. Now, it's important to understand that this procedure should be performed only after 18 weeks. Because if you do it before 18 weeks, the loss of the healthy baby is almost 40%. And after 18 weeks, it drops down to about 3%. So about 70 to 80% successful outcomes have been reported. Some centers report up to 85% from bipolar cord occlusion. The next thing we are going to talk about is Leica discordancies in monoclonic twins. So when we assess Leica, we always measure single deepest vertical pool in each sac. Less than 2 centimeters and more than 8 centimeters are abnormal. We never report amniotic fluid index in monoclonic twins or even in diclonic twins. So when there is normal Leica on one sac, oligo or reduced Leica on the other side, we think of anomalies, selective growth restriction, intrauterine growth restriction, and premature rupture of membranes. When there is a normal Leica on one side, polyhydramnios on the other side, we need to rule out anomalies. And when there is we do close surveillance for evolving problems. When there's polyhydramnios on one side and severe oligohydramnios on the other side, we call this as twin-twin transfusion syndrome. Now, we also need to map the cord insertions. All twins must, in fact, it's a good practice to map cord insertions for even singleton pregnancies. So here you can see a central cord insertion, and here you can see a velamentous cord insertion, marginal cord insertion, and velamentous cord insertion. Marginal cord insertion is where the cord is inserted less than 2 centimeters from the edge. Now, when you look at velamentous cord insertion, you'll see that 30% of them will be with birth weight discordance, and without birth weight discordance, 16%. The placental sharing discordance will be seen in 36% versus 17%. So velamentous cord insertion is something we need to look for. In our own series, in a year, out of 42 patients, you can see that normal twin had 86% of them had central cord insertion, only 17% had marginal or velamentous. Whereas SIUGR, 69% had velamentous cord insertion. So looking at velamentous cord insertion is very important. So the key messages here are discordancy of any sort should be closely monitored. Concordant measurements should not lead to false reassurance against complications. But everything is going fine, we just say come back in 2 weeks' time, because within a week something can change. because of hemodynamic disturbances. So we have to be very careful about that. Now let's go to some specific conditions. Twin-twin transfusion syndrome, selective fetal growth restriction, twin anemia polycythemia sequence, trap sequence, and single fetal demise. Now, twin-twin transfusion syndrome is a hemodynamic problem occurring in the placenta. It's a problem of hemodynamic imbalance. It is not a problem of the baby, but it's a problem of the placenta. There's volume overload to the recipient twin, and hence cardiac evaluation is essential. And this cardiac evaluation is done even before the development of twin-twin transfusion, because sometimes the cardiac changes will be the first thing that may come up before even the other findings of TTTS show up. For diagnosis of twin-twin transfusion, we must have oligopoly, that is less than 2, more than 8. And here you can see a struck twin and as polyhydramnios, which is typical TTTS. Whereas here you can see that there is good amount of liquor in the sac, even though there's polyhydramnios on the other side. This is not twin-twin transfusion. And sometimes what can happen, the membrane can wrap around the baby, and this can be measured at one sac, and this can be measured as another sac. Whereas you can see the fluid on the other sac is in between the 2 layers. So extremely important to carefully evaluate the membrane, because the membrane will be very thin. Then once you identify twin-twin transfusion syndrome, we need to divide them into stages. And even though Quintro staging is not very accurate, we still use Quintro staging, because several other stagings have not found to be very, very useful. But in Quintro stage 1, you'll see both bladders are seen. There is oligopoly. In stage 2, the bladder of the donor is not seen, and there's polyhydramnios, and there's a large bladder, distended bladder of the recipient. In stage 3, there is also Doppler abnormality. Could be umbilical artery, and mostly you will see ductus venosus abnormality because of the volume overload. And when it comes to stage 4, you find there's high drops of the recipient, and stage 5 will be intrauterine fetal death of one of them. Hopefully, in this day and age, we should not allow babies to go into stage 4 and stage 5. We should follow them up very closely, catch them at the appropriate time, and institute appropriate treatment. But it's also important to remember that when I see a baby with stage 1, I cannot tell the patient in 2 weeks' time it will become stage 2, or in 1 week's time it will become stage 2, or it will become stage 3. Baby can go from stage 1 to stage 3, or stage 3 to stage 5. Things can happen very dramatically within a short period of time. Or it can remain in stage 1 or stage 2 for a very long time. So progression is not sequential. But cardiac assessment in monochorionic twins is important, because we are looking for increased cardiac load and also AV regurgitation. And then we look for cardiomegaly, myocardial hypertrophy, and dysfunction. You can see the thick myocardial hypertrophy here, and also RVOT obstruction. Pulmonary stenosis and pulmonary atresia are things which you need to evaluate for. Remember, this baby, this is going to be the recipient baby. It's going to be moving around a lot, but we have to have enormous amount of patience to ensure that this is achieved, because this forms part of routine examination. Right. Now, how do we measure cardiac function? We need to measure the myocardial performance index, or the T index, which is nothing but you get the mitral valve and the aorta, and you get the isometric contraction time, the isometric relaxation time, and the ejection time, and the myocardial performance, it can be calculated. Now, assessment of the fetal heart in a baby with twin-twin transfusion syndrome. Several authors have given several protocols. The CHOP, or Children's Hospital of Philadelphia score, or CHOP score, is probably one of the earliest to come. And many centers follow this. It's quite, you have to get the CT ratio, the ventricular wall thickness, ventricular dysfunction, then AV inflow, regurgitation, and also the pulmonary regurgitation, outflow tract size, DV Doppler, umbilical vein Doppler, eye drops, and umbilical artery Doppler. So you do a lot of parameters to look for scoring. Similarly, you have the cardiovascular profile score, Cincinnati score, and Steinman said, just look at the T index of RV and LV and you'll get what you want. So the cardiac scoring CHOP score, for each of these parameters, a score is given, and then you add up the scores. And if the score is more than 15, then you call it a severe. 10 to 14, you call it as moderate, moderately severe, and 5 to 9 is moderate. Now, this is helped to prognosticate about this patient, and you tell the patient already that even if I do laser, this baby is going to have a tough time because the cardiac profile is very high. So what is the treatment for twin-twin transfusion syndrome? Stage 1 twin-twin transfusion syndrome is generally expectant management, but there are some centers favor doing laser for stage 1. So at present, among many centers in the world, we call it what is known as equipoise. That is, if the mother has discomfort and if there is severe polyhydramnios on the other side, even though the bladder is seen in the donor baby, it is still in stage 1, we go ahead and do the laser. But if the mother is comfortable, then we want to buy some more time. We will see whether it progresses stage 2. Stage 2 and 3, prior to 26 weeks, selective laser photocoagulation is the treatment of choice. And stage 2 and 3, after 27 weeks, serial amnioreduction can be done just to buy some more time so that the babies can be delivered. And stage 4, we need to individualize the treatment, talk to the parents whether we're going to do laser or selective feticide. So amnioreduction, use an 18-gauge needle, attach a suction apparatus, and suck out the fluid as quickly as possible. Up to 4 to 4.5 liters can be removed in one sitting. And when you do selective laser photocoagulation, done completely under local anesthesia, and once the scope goes inside, we identify the membrane, and you see the vessels which are coming out of the membrane. And once you trace them, as you can see the membrane is traced, you can go and see the anastomosis on the other side. As you can see this color of this vessel is more red, and the color of the vessel is more black. So this is the artery, and that's the vein. So there's an arteriovenous anastomosis here, and you can see them dipping down into the placenta, and that's where you do the laser on both sides. So once all the anastomoses are lasered, you can connect the dots, and then you can remove after draining out the excess fluid. So and then you find bladder in the donor is seen in about 24 to 48 hours. Liker normalization occurs in about a week's time, and about 75% success rate for single survivors and 50% about double survivors. So either or, you can get about 75 to 80%. The next condition we are going to discuss is called selective fetal growth restriction. It's a term applied in a twin pregnancy when one baby is small and the other baby is growing normally. When the estimated fetal weight is less than 10th centile in one fetus, it has more value than the discordancy in the size. Because discordancy in the size is just a relative term. Because the other baby can be larger and this baby can be normal size, still you will have a discordancy. So when the estimated fetal weight of one of the twins is less than the 10th centile, that qualifies for being termed as growth restriction. And then we need to do the umbilical artery Doppler, and once we do the umbilical artery Doppler, we can classify what type of selective IUGR it is. Here it is important to understand that there is this vascular anastomosis, the presence of the arterial anastomosis. Now let me explain for a minute what happens here. Now remember, this baby is small and the other baby is normal size, and this AEA anastomosis is pushing blood back and forth. Now because the baby is small, let us assume the blood pressure of baby is small, then immediately what will happen, blood will come from the other side through the AA in this direction. Now once the blood pressure is settled down and the baby is pumping out the blood more, immediately the blood will go to the opposite direction. So what is happening is the smaller baby is subjected to a lot of blood pressure changes. Even the larger baby is subjected to a lot of blood pressure changes. Imagine when one baby suddenly dies. Now, when one baby suddenly dies, this AA anastomosis is completely, the channel is open and blood will rush through it to the other side. So this baby dies, its blood pressure becomes zero, and it will suck out the blood from the other baby. The normal baby will exsanguinate into this baby, causing problems for the normal baby. And that's why we are extremely concerned about this. So in order to identify which one is going to do well, Gratakos and his group proposed a classification system where they said if the umbilical artery shows forward flow, then we call it as type 1. Forward flow can be high resistant. When there is consistent absent diastolic flow, it is called type 2. And when there is intermittent absent and reverse diastolic flow, then we call it as type 3. So you will have different types of flows here. This means hemodynamically unstable. The large AA anastomosis is functioning, and that's why this baby is very unstable. And it's called type 3. So in type 1, generally prognosis is good. There's a long latency period. In type 2 and 3, the risk of intrauterine death is about 25 to 50%. And more importantly, the neurological sequelae is again 25 to 50%. Remember, it is a type 2, which is at very high risk of intrauterine death, and type 3 is at high risk for neurological sequelae. So you can see the latency period is very long. Type 1 generally remains type 1 for a very long time, and type 2 has got a very short latency period, and type 3 again very long latency period, but can cause damage here. Survival in IUGR of the IUGR baby is very high in type 1, and type 2 is very low, and type 3 also will survive, but it will have higher neurological complication. Hemodynamic accidents are very low only if IUFT, and hemodynamic accidents are higher in type 3. So GA delivery, the type 2 are delivered earlier, whereas type 3 and type 4 can be delivered 34 weeks and after. So generally it is said that Doppler patterns do not change after 20 weeks, but in our own series, we have seen Doppler pattern changes. I think more work need to be done in this area. So treatment options for selective fetal growth restriction: type 1, expectant management; type 2 and type 3, bipolar cord occlusion, laser photocoagulation, or radiofrequency ablation for the smaller twin. Now, selection criteria for treatment when the discordancy is greater than 35%, type 2 or type 3, stuck twin, and when the DVPI is greater than 95th centile. So instead of oligohydramnios, if the single deepest vertical pool is less than 1 centimeter, we call it a stuck twin. And such stuck twins has a high chance of getting into complications. So here's a primee, 25 weeks with 38% discordancy. Mother had a blood pressure of 150/110, and it was a stuck twin. So we did there was no approach for bipolar. So we did a radiofrequency ablation, and within 48 hours, the maternal blood pressure reverted to normal, and the baby was delivered at 33 weeks, and it's quite well on follow-up. So this is one way of saving the baby. Now there are other methods. You could do bipolar cord occlusion, as I said earlier, but that would require filling up of the sac, You can also do radio frequency ablation, as we said, but also some centers, some countries where they don't allow fetal reduction, then they do laser for decoronization. So you go near the membrane and simply draw a line completely across. Once you draw the line, then you find that all the vessels that are coming out are there. But the problem is you may be cutting off some supply to the smaller twin from the larger twin, and that may result in an intra-twin demise. So these are the methods of treatment. Now, when you look at the survival rates, with expectant management, with survival about 40 to 85%, when for the growth restricted baby, and about 85% for the appropriately grown baby. When you do laser, you get about 90% survival and about 40% survival. So even if you do laser, the smaller baby is not going to do well. And when the sequelae is seen once you do laser, the sequelae in appropriately grown baby is less, and in the growth restricted baby is about 15% or so. Whereas here, with expectant management, the sequelae is very high. So in essence, what you're doing is trying to save the baby from neurological complications. Then comes twin anemia polycythemia sequence. When there are large inter-twin hemoglobin differences, there is no twin oligo-poly sequence. So when you see a baby with both Likers appears to be normal, but you find through the MCA Doppler, one baby showing 1.5, 1.6 mom, the other baby showing 0.8 mom, huge difference in the MCA Dopplers. And when you look at the placenta, here you can see the area supplying the recipient placenta and the donor placenta. So it's larger, and this becomes very small. So the appearance of the placenta is quite dramatic in this area. So this is the recipient baby, which is completely polycythemic, and this is the donor baby, which is anemic. So spontaneous taps can occur in 3 to 5%, post laser in 2 to 13%. The recipient is anemic, and the donor is usually polycythemic. So Doppler, this patient came to us for second opinion for intrahepatic calcification, spontaneous conception. But what we actually found, there was no TTTS, but MCA PSV was high and it was low on the other side. So it was a case of twin anemia polycythemia sequence. And if the donor is greater than 1.5 mom, recipient is less than 1 mom, the difference, inter-twin hemoglobin difference, is more than 8, and it's called as stage 1. So like that, you can classify when there's high drops of the donor, the inter-twin hemoglobin is more than 17, and it is called stage 4. So this baby, when we looked at it, we found the Doppler feature of cardiac compromise in the donor and abnormal venous flow, the recipient twin, and this was staged as stage 3 taps, and the baby was immediately delivered. So emergency LSCS was done, 1,760 grams, 11 grams, and 26 grams. At partial exchange transfusion, and postnatal classification of stage 3 was consistent with the antenatal classification. Now, how do you manage TAPS? It all depends on the gestational age. Generally, TAPS occurs very slowly. It does not occur very rapidly, very slowly. So you might be able to buy some time till there are some changes happening in the babies. So you can do expectant management, or you can do intrauterine transfusion of packed cells for one baby. And the problem will be the polycythemic twin should not become even more polycythemic and can get necrosis of the tips of the fingers. Fetoscopic laser surgery has been done, only very few cases. Intrauterine transfusion followed by laser surgery, or intrauterine transfusion with partial exchange transfusion for the polycythemic twin. All these have been tried, but the numbers are very low to come to any conclusion. The last thing I'm going to tell you about is the twin reversed arterial perfusion sequence. this is a condition where there's an A cardiac twin and there's a normal twin. There have been several publications in this area to see whether we should treat all of them, expectant management. The current consensus is that A cardiac twin, you should go and do an interventional procedure. And in our own series of 91 cases, which we have just published in Prenatal Diagnosis, the live birth rate with intrafetal laser is 81.4%, median gestation age at 37 weeks with a mean birth weight of 2,350 grams. Now, with conservative management, 68% live birth rate, and again, gestation age 37 weeks. So there is a distinct advantage of going and doing selective occlusion in this case. So the interventions which can be done in this case is, we can do a radiofrequency ablation with perinatal survivals of over 90% reported. In this case, there was no intervention required because automatically the trap became avascular, but there are reports which says even if the trap has become avascular, the pump twin has a chance of dying. And the procedure of our choice, which we do, is interstitial laser. 18 gauge needle is introduced into the vessel which is going into the hilum, and you have, in our 48 cases, one cohort, we had an 84% success rate. We use a 40-watt laser. We use about 20 watts or so for doing that. And this is a radiofrequency ablation of the A cardiac twin. We can use the needle, usually 1 or 2 cycles required. We do it at 110 degrees at 150 watts. Right. So the timing of the procedure is preferably done after 15 weeks, even though there are reports you can do A cardiac laserization at the 11 to 14 weeks time, but it has got a 50% loss rate, which is there. So we prefer to do it after 15 to 16 weeks. And there is, of course, a miscarriage rate over 6%. Indication-based outcomes for radiofrequency ablation for structural, chromosomal, and genetic indications, 92%. For TDTS and others, 78%. And the North American Fetal Therapy Network has showed live birth rate of trap of 80%, which is similar to our own series. Right. Then one word about monoamniotic twins. Momo twins generally have cord entanglement. Almost all of them have cord entanglement. But if momo twins, one of them is abnormal, or if one of them has abnormal Dopplers, then we might need to do an intervention of cord occlusion in one of them. Very difficult because you don't know which cord is going to which, and we have to be careful about doing the cord occlusion. And some people advocate transection of the cord. We have done 3 cases where we have transected the cord after occlusion, but some of them believe that is not required. So then comes single fetal demise, and single fetal demise can happen in monochorionic twins in the first trimester. And people say, are there increased risks to the co-twin because of transfer of thrombotic material? But it is shown that loss of one twin in the first trimester does not impair the development of the surviving twin. Whereas when it happens later, co-twin demise in 12 to 25%, there is acute transfer of intravascular volume of the hypotensive dying fetus can suck the blood from the other baby, and hence neurological sequelae for the surviving twin, anemia, cardiac failure. So close monitoring is done, and you do an MRI 3 weeks post-demise, and also do a good neurosonogram to look for any vascular complications in the head. So multiple pregnancy, we should look risks beyond the fetus, like GDM, hemorrhage, anemia, maternal anemia, hypertension, preeclampsia, preterm labor. All these need to be considered because all these are factors which can cause early delivery. even though you do a procedure, there's a procedure-related loss, but there's also a maternal morbidity-related loss which can happen. So if you look at the timing of delivery, you can see that when you look at the neonatal morbidity, you can see in twins, after 38 weeks, that's a steep rise in mortality. So twins never allowed to go beyond 38 weeks. And in uncomplicated monochorionic twins, elective birth from 36 weeks onwards, no increased risk of serious adverse outcomes. Continuing beyond 38 weeks increases the risk of fetal death, right? And that's important to know. In complicated monochorionic twins, like twin-twin transfusion and other conditions, even if they cross 34 or 35 weeks, then we might want to deliver at the time. And selective IUGR, it's all based on the individual babies, how they are doing, and the timing is taken based on Doppler findings, maternal findings, and it's an obstetric decision may be taken. So a simplified approach, confirm chorionicity in the first trimester, rule out malformations, early diagnosis of complications. If variations are detected, refer to a tertiary center, close follow-up and counseling, intervention if indicated, and thank you for a patient listening. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a very informative talk on monochorionic twins, and it is surely a academic feast for all the and today. We have got huge response in the form of questions. I'll read out the question to you, sir.
Yes.
Okay, the first question is, if one fetal demise occurs at 30-week gestation, how do you manage the second twin?
Yes. Please remember that when the demise occurs in a monochorionic twin, the damage to the other baby happens at the time of demise. So there is no way of preventing anything. So going and hurriedly delivering the baby immediately will actually cause problems for preterm complications for the other twin. So we just wait. We do a serial assessment, and 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, we can do a good neurosonogram and do the MRI. What we do immediately is the middle cerebral artery Doppler for the surviving twin. If the MCA Doppler shows high velocity, then we know the baby is anemic and exsanguination has occurred. But some people have tried giving an intrauterine transfusion, but that does not prevent the brain damage which will happen. So our hands are completely tied at that point. If it happens much later, then you might consider delivery. If it's not too preterm, then you might consider delivery of the other baby.
Yeah. So the next question is timing of delivery for both monochorionic and dichorionic twins.
Yes. So I think I had given it in the last sentence. In monochorionic twins, after 38 weeks, there's a very steep rise in the morbidity, whereas in dichorionic twins also, you can see the elective birth from 37 weeks onwards, continuing beyond 38 weeks, increase the risk of fetal death. In complicated twins, then the timing has to be adjusted according to the nature of the complication and the need of the hour. It has to be individualized.
Okay. And so the next question is there anything called as negative lambda sign?
Negative lambda sign? Well, I would assume if somebody has reported that, they'll say no lambda sign, and that's why it is monochorionic twins. I've never heard of negative lambdas.
The question is determination of chorionicity. How, when, at what gestational age?
Okay, determination of chorionicity is best done between 11 to 14 weeks, with 100% certainty. Can be done with 100% certainty. Well, in medical parlance, if you say 100%, you are likely to be booed. So 99.9%.
Okay.
To be
Next
honest.
question is, what is the state discordancy in selecting IUGR to proceed for RFA?
Yeah, so I put it up there. When the discordancy is more than 35%, when there is a stuck twin, when the ductus venosus PI is greater than 95th centile in the smaller twin, any of these combinations, then there is an indication for RFA. And type 2 or type 3 SFGR.
Which CRL, bigger or smaller, should be considered for date correction in natural conception MCDA twins?
Okay, so natural conception, in monochorionic twins, they advise the smaller twin, mainly because you might, if you date by the larger twin, then the smaller twin will be called as higher calling of SIUGR will happen. So, but this is still, there is still one group which says you can take the average CRL and give the dating, but that's still the general recommendation in twins is to use the CRL of the larger twin. But there are some discussions going on in this area now. We use the larger twin.
The next question.
Yeah.
Okay, sir, as you told that average NT is to be considered for combined screening, but what about nasal bone stage? If one fetus is with nasal bone ossified and another one has unified.
That's what. See, in monochorionic, see, in monochorionic twins, this is a problem because you not have a monochorionic twin that one baby is Down syndrome and the other baby is normal. Very, very rare. Heterokaryotypic is very, very rare. So we consider both of them will have, and that's why the sensitivity of these markers are poorer. They're poorer. So we have a problem in adding up all these markers.
Next question is, how many samples should be collected in MCMA twins during CVS?
No, how the sample to be collected in MCMA?
So how many? Yes, sir.
MCMA. So monoamniotic twins. How the sample should be collected? See, generally in twins, amnio is preferred to CVS. Amnio is preferred to CVS. That is the general consensus. In dichorionic twins, if you are a real expert, we can do double CVS because there's a high chance of contamination from the other side if the placentae are close to each other. And also, because of it is preferable to push the amnio to about 17 to 18 weeks rather than doing it at 15 or 16 weeks. So amnio is preferred to CVS. But if you are looking at molecular testing in a momo twins, then I believe that CVS can also be done. But like a routine CVS, that's all. Like a singleton pregnancy.
Okay. The next question is, how often should the cardiac evaluation be scheduled in MCDA without evidence of TTTS yet?
In monochorionic twins, in monochorionic twins,
how should be done for cardiac evaluation?
No, I'm not able to hear you well. The voice is not coming well.
Okay,
because
sir.
Can you repeat that?
Okay, sir. Sure, sir. So, how often should the cardiac evaluation be scheduled in MCDA without evidence of TTTS yet? And with every 2 weekly routine monitoring should be cardiac evaluation to be planned, sir? That's the
Okay.
question.
So, yeah. So, in after 18 weeks, you must look at the heart look at the size of the heart and also look for possible evidence of TR, and we always look for MPI. We have seen fetuses change within 1 week, and when we went back, we found that the MPI was altered, but we didn't give much of importance to that. So it's important to see the cardiac, the heart in all monochronic twins at every visit. Just look at the heart, let's see whether it's slightly enlarged. The moment it's enlarged, you know that that heart is likely to get into trouble. So it is recommended that you follow them up with the cardiac evaluation. All you need to do is look for TR, look for MPI, TRMR and MPI. And also, of course, if you see TRMR or high MPI, then your pulmonary outflow obstruction needs to be looked for, and if the heart is enlarged.
And so what is the role of NIPT in
So NIPT in twins, as I said, in monochronic twins, it performs as well as it performs in singleton. In dichronic twins, the problem is, supposing fetus A is Down syndrome, and the fetal fraction from that baby is less than 4%, then the baby B has got a higher fetal fraction, then the report will come as negative. So there's a chance of a false negative. So from 99.9%, the sensitivity goes down to about 94%. But things are slowly changing. They're finding ways and means of doing that. But still, it is not there where we want it to be. That's slightly, marginally more than your other screening tests which are there.
Okay. The next question is, are there cases where partial exchange transfusion for TAP in your
Pardon?
series?
Are there? Are there?
Are there cases where partial exchange transfusion for TAP in your series?
Are there cases of partial? You're talking about intrauterine partial exchange transfusion. No. We have not done. Very few centers have done this for partial exchange transfusion for the polycythemic twin. We have not done that. We have not had an opportunity to do it so far. Most of our TAPS babies, we managed to push them and we got them out. Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The next question is, embryonic pregnancy, parents wants to go for fetal reduction. What parameter we should see on ultrasound and timing of fetal reduction?
In MCDA twins, fetal reduction in MCDA twins?
Yes, monochronic pregnancy, sir.
Why would they want to go for fetal reduction? See, fetal reduction by choice in an MCDA twin should not be offered when everything is normal. Okay, that I believe in that because the procedure related complications are much more. So it's not easy to do selective fetal reduction in a normal monochronic twin, because you do it by radiofrequency ablation or bipolar cord occlusion. Both of them have got significant loss rate for the whole pregnancy. So I will not go and interfere with a normal MCDA twin. I'll discourage the parents from doing that.
So the next question is, what should be the process at rural hospitals level.
What should be the
Protocol
what? Ah,
at rural hospitals. What should be the
okay.
protocol?
So rural or urban, it doesn't matter because that is a twin pregnancy, that is a monochronic twin pregnancy. You need to follow them up, and you when there is any sign of discordance or variation, because that will be the first filter. The patient needs to be transported to a higher center. There's no other choice. Because unless you do the protocol of following up, you will not pick up the abnormalities. And when you pick up these abnormalities early, then those twins have a much better chance. Because we've had patients who have come in and the liquor in the polyhydramnios sac, single deepest pool was like 20 centimeters. And the mother couldn't even lie down. And she says, for the past 3 weeks, I've been like this. So somebody said, you wait and see, let's do this, let's do that, wait and see. So you have to know when exactly to refer to the next center. And that's the whole idea of screening MCDA twins. So there's really no change between urban and rural.
Okay, so the last question, how much level of amniotic reduced in amino reduction in single
Reduction.
sitting?
Okay. So generally what we do is to reduce the amniotic fluid till the single deepest pool is about 8 centimeters or so. Okay, around it, because that is the limit which we say, about 8 centimeters. The maximum amount we have is removed in one sitting is 4.5 liters, which we have done. Generally, in most of these cases, 2 liters, 2.5 liters, 4.5 liters is the maximum we have needed to remove because of the polyhydramnion situation. So that's see, also one thing I would like to tell you is when laser is done, and if the point of entry is in the right iliac fossa or left iliac fossa, there's a higher chance of leakage of amniotic fluid into the maternal peritoneal cavity. So in those cases, we reduce it to about, when the single deepest pool, about 9, and we leave it like that because there'll be some leak into the peritoneal cavity, which will absorb later on. But standard amnio reduction, you can go up to 4 liters without a problem.
Thank you very much, sir, for
Thank you. Thank you. It's a
I would
pleasure.
like to thank all the